My daughter-in-law said, "I always hated you." But when she watched that video, she was stunned. One gravestone, one secret, one betrayal, and at 73, a man decides it's time to take revenge on silence itself. Elias Granger had been small talk at neighborhood barbecues for decades, polite, steady, the kind of man whose quiet presence made larger personalities feel louder by comparison. He had never been dramatic, never flirted with spectacle. His life with Clara had been patient and ordinary in the best of ways. Long morning coffees, the same chipped plates, a garden that yielded tomatoes in August and complaints in winter. After Clara died, people said the worst thing a neighbor can say about a man. He's lonely, bless him. Elias lived into that sentence for a while, not because he wanted to, but because the world around him made it easy to be small. He visited her grave as though it were a clock he wound each week. He knelt in the damp and laid chrysanthemums, the way some people brush their teeth, automatic, necessary, unexamined. He spoke to her there in a voice that had, over 50 years, learned how to be forgiving by default. "I did the shopping like you said," he'd tell the stone. "I fixed the garage light. We survived February." He wanted, at first, the simplest consolation, an echo, a memory, something to confirm that the life they'd had was real. Then he found the letter. Hidden in a book on the top shelf, the book Clara loved and never read aloud, a letter in handwriting he recognized as soft as wind, addressed to a name that was a sting, Henry. The "You make me feel alive in the middle of the week. Forgive me for the cowardice of St. Henry Mercer." The man whose funeral Elias had attended, whose grave lay a few rows over, the neighbor who'd once laughed over shared beers and helped Elias on winter mornings with his gutter. Henry had been dead for years. Elias had buried him, believing with the rest of the town that grief is finished when the last shovel is thrown and the wreaths droop. He had not expected to find the truth buried inside the bindings of a paperback, like a trapdoor. For days Elias moved through the house as if space had shifted. A line of chords had been cut, and the melody of his life changed key. He could have burned the letter, thrown it into the sea, dissolved it with vinegar and salt, and pretended the world was as polite and uncomplicated as everyone else wanted it to be. Instead, he kept it folded in an old spectacles case, and read it at night with the lamp dimmed until the paper smelled like ash and memory. That is how love becomes grievance, not with fireworks, but through a sustained, patient contraction. He practiced forgiving in the mornings. Then at noon he would scrub the sink until the grooves in his knuckles shined, and at night he'd write. At first, the letters were addressed to Clara, the soft, ridiculous habit of speaking to the absent, but the ink turned brisker and more exact. He wrote to Henry as if composing an accusation in polite script. "You left me a life stitched with lies. You took dances I thought were mine. You owed me not an apology but an account." He wrote to himself to make sure his hand still knew truth. "I will not be the man who dies carrying someone else's shame." Pages turned into boxes. The habit of ink replaced the habit of silence. Somewhere in those nights a plan formed, not of cruelty but of arithmetic. Reveal, not to ruin, but to free. Elias didn't want to dismantle people for sport. He wanted the world to know the full ledger, so that the lies could not stealthily keep building someone's reputation on the bones of another man's life. He began, almost at once, to gather what the letter hinted at, small things that had been easy to miss when your faith in the people around you was unexamined. A photograph tucked behind an album of wedding Polaroids, a pressed flower in the seams of a coat, a receipt from an inn in a town 2 counties away dated to a year he had thought Clara was with him, a card, crudely hidden in Henry's handwriting, offering consolation. Each fragment was a tiny arrow. Elias cataloged them carefully, not as a man possessed by accusation, but as an archivist of truth. It was an odd kind of revenge to collect evidence the way a careful gardener collects seed, methodical, patient, sure that what is planted will not be wasted. He hired, quietly, a retired lockpicker and a young woman who ran an antique store several towns over, people with the necessary nimbleness to retrieve a postcard from a desk or a slipped-away envelope without ringing the bell of scandal. He paid with the small savings he'd tucked away over decades, the money people think is trivial until they need to pay for dignity. He was precise about boundaries. No public entrapments, no illegal break-ins, only what the public world would show if someone bothered to look. He wrote to Daniel, his son, but unlike the raw letter that later took the shape of confession, the early communication was an invitation to watch. He called his son to lunch under the neutral pretense of roast, of family, of the normal Sunday where old men and grandchildren pass casseroles and pretend medicine is not the main topic. He listened to Daniel talk about projects, to Elise's thin smiles that had strength but not tenderness. He watched the children scroll, the way modern life swaddles attention into small glass rectangles, and he understood that when family diminishes into habit, a betrayal can slide in unremarked. His revenge would not be a scream in the night. It would be a narrowing of the lens until what was true fit in the frame and could no longer be ignored. The day he gave Daniel the sealed envelope, he walked with an odd lightness. He'd rehearsed nothing. This was no theatrical justice against a living sinner, but the letter itself was a device of anatomy. It named names without hatred. It offered the evidence he had found. It placed no instructions, only the raw components of truth. "Open it after I'm gone," he said, because he wanted the confession to be his to give, not a lever to pry his son's life apart, while he still existed as a fragile instrument of scandal. Daniel took the envelope, suspicion and concern folding his face in lines Elias had seen since childhood. Later, when the old man did not answer the phone for 3 days, Daniel came and found Elias in his chair, rings turning on fingers, notebooks like little monuments stacked around him, one last teacup cooling. The image of his father still, as if listening to music no one else could hear, carved into Daniel's bones in a way even confession could not have. In the weeks after Elias's death, the town distantly mourned what they assumed. A gentle man was gone, and the routine of condolence began. It was only later, when the notebooks were found, when the sealed letter was opened and its lines read aloud in a kitchen where the light slanted like knives, that the slow engine of revelation began. But revelation, to Elias, had been arranged long before his breath stopped. He had seeded the town with small, logical facts and a single, unavoidable emotional moment. He had arranged, with the care of a watchmaker, the sequence in which truth would appear. First, the photographs. A friend who kept an old shoebox finding an image, scanners and copies. A file emailed anonymously to a local journalist. The journalist, curious for a local color piece, ran a clean, almost shy headline. Old photographs emerge of town couples hidden years. Readers glanced and moved on. The pattern of scandal is a weather phenomenon that often passes unremarked. Next came the testimony, not from Elias, but from the ledger of evidence he'd built. Receipts, names, notes in unknown hands. People began to ask tiny questions. Who was Henry? Why do these dates overlap? That is how gossip grows into inquiry when the simple curiosity of one neighbor becomes the lock that opens another door. Daniel felt the ground shift under his feet. He read his father's notebooks and did what few people can do at the edge of their own life. He met the anger, sat with it until it softened into something else. A bewildered grief for loss that had been lived inside a lie. Elise, affronted at first, recoiled from the disorientation of having her family's narrative rewritten. But the town is small, and the evidence was not lurid enough to be salacious. It was, instead, stubbornly banal, the precise details of a life lived in parallel. Elias's revenge, thus, was twofold. The psychological component was the meticulous documentation, the slow, inexorable curation of facts that eroded the gleaming, convenient mythology that had soothed so many. The emotional component was the way he placed the truth directly into his son's hands and then removed himself as a participant. He allowed Daniel the space to own what was now known, to choose how to carry it without being coerced into spectacle. It was justice with a moral economy. Give the truth, then step back to let grief and responsibility do the work. The community reacted as communities do, some with indignation, some with sympathy, some with curiosity. Old friends looked sideways at the house where Clara had once hummed. Some neighbors crossed the street to avoid the complexity of being on a street where betrayal had lived. Others came to Daniel's door with casseroles and questions, because community is reflexively practical. Daniel, after the first shock, read every notebook. He found among the fury a tenderness he hadn't expected. His father's sentences were not only blame, but a patient collapse of the weight he had carried. "I loved you in the small ways," Elias had written to Clara in a page that made Daniel weep because the language was clean and honest, not performatively righteous. "I loved the coffee grounds you always spilled on the counter. I loved the way you read under the lamp. I forgive you if you were ever afraid to be honest. But I will not be the man who carries on in silence so a stranger's reputation stays tidy." Daniel began to understand the grand cruelty of silence, how it protects everyone's comfort, until it calcifies into a lie that eventually crushes the one who keeps it. He spoke awkwardly to his children, and the conversations were clumsy at first: tears, raised voices, a child's bewildered question. Was Grandma bad? But slowly, truth remade the household. It did not remake it into something whole overnight. It remade it into something adult. People took sides, of course. Human affairs rarely do anything else. But Elias's plan had not been to scorch the earth, it had been to reroute its water. He had engineered a sequence where pain would lead to examination, and examination to a kind of accountability that could not be skipped by polite silence. The notebooks, once published by a small press Daniel trusted, cast Elias's voice into the world beyond Denver. They screened quietly into the hands of caretakers, counselors, late-night readers, people who recognized in his sentences their own futures, if they didn't speak. Soon, letters arrived at Daniel's door from strangers, thanking his father for naming what they themselves couldn't. A woman wrote that the book had helped her leave a marriage where the cost of silence had become too high. A young man confessed that the text had allowed him to forgive the man who had failed his mother. Those messages were not victories in any gaudy sense. They were small recalibrations in private lives. Elias's revenge, in the end, had been to convert a private wound into public medicine, to trade secrecy for conversation, and in so doing, to release the weight that had kept him tethered to a life he no longer recognized. There were moments of cruelty. An impulsive neighbor called Clara a liar in a market queue, and then spent the rest of the day apologizing, but those were human misfires, part of the cleanup of any revelation. More importantly, Daniel found empathy that surprised him for both Clara and his father. He saw in his mother a woman who had been complex in ways he'd never imagined, torn between desire and duty. He saw in his father a man who chose dignity over spectacle, truth over revenge that would only replicate harm. The town learned to speak more plainly. People visited the cemetery less out of ritual and more out of listening. They lingered at graves with questions, telling stories about who the dead had been beyond the memorial quotes. Elias's bench, where he'd sat each week, became a place where people left notes, apologies not always to the dead, but to themselves. Years later, at a small memorial for Elias, Daniel read a passage aloud. Revenge isn't always a sword. Sometimes it is the steady hand that opens the shutter and lets light in. Sometimes it is putting the truth on the table and saying, "No more silence." The gathered crowd, some still resentful, some grateful, many quietly changed, applauded in a way that sounded to Daniel like forgiveness and like grief braided into one. He had expected fury. He found something like relief. In the end, the satisfaction Elias had wanted wasn't theatrical. It was quieter. The knowledge that a life of careful observation and scrupulous honesty could overturn an elegant lie. He had planned not to triumph over enemies, but to free the people he loved from the weight of the unspoken. That kind of victory is subtle. It is the soft lift of a burden from a shoulder, the slackening of a jaw that hasn't smiled in a decade, the crooked, honest laugh that bursts unexpectedly from a person who has stopped pretending. On clear mornings, when Daniel walks past the cemetery bench now, he sometimes thinks he hears his father's step, not as a phantom, but as an imprint. He brings flowers sometimes, not because ritual demands it, but because memory now rests in the open air, handled, named, and not smothered under the polite blankets of silence. And if you ask whether Elias's revenge was cruel or merciful, his son would tell you it was both in equal measure, a scalpel to cut the rot, but also a salve for a wound that could not be healed by pretending it did not exist. The town eventually forgave itself, oddly enough not by forgetting, but by acknowledging. And from that honest, awkward place grew a small courage among people who had once preferred the gentle lie. They began to speak.